Take it away. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I know a lot of you, but if I don't know you, my name is Monica Furey. I'm so lucky to have been. I did my PhD here in the program that you guys are in charge of, the leadership. I can't remember all the initials now. LEAD, right? Leadership Foundation, policy, and all of it. All of it. That I did. So glad to be here with you. And I am really excited about this program because as a social worker, the foundation of our session is based on the NASW, the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. So I was super excited to find out about the Ethics Fund Fellowship and so happy and feel so lucky to have received it for this year. And so here I am going to talk to you all about ethical identity development in students. I am a professor in the social work department. I'm a clinical professor, which means that I do much more teaching than research, but I also have an interest in research. And I also just a few weeks ago got appointed to be the MSW, the Masters in Social Work Practicum or Field Internship Director. So have a whole lot more work than I expected. And I'm learning this new job as we go along these first 6 weeks of school. So interestingly, a great deal of the work that I did on this is also within the practicum, or we call it practicum now, used to be called field internship program. So you're going to be hearing a lot about that as well before it. Okay, let's get started. So I just wanted to thank the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, even though it's not that anymore. I wasn't really sure how we were doing with the branding because when I received this, it was like we were really instructed to make sure that we got it all right. So I hope I did that right, but also the UCCS College of Business. My UCCS social work students in both the BSW and the MSW program, Kimberly Toomey, who's a BSW student, and my graduate assistant, or not graduate, but student assistant, and then Dr. Stephanie Gangemi, who is a forever fellow, as Tracy likes to refer to them, and also an amazing mentor helping with this project. All right, our agenda. First, I'm going to tell you about my personal connection to ethics. We're going to talk about the Daniels Fund Ethics Principles versus National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics Principles. We're going to do a little case study. So I'm so happy that so many of you are here. And for those of you online, we're going to put you into small groups so that you can also participate in a case study. We're going to talk about classroom opportunities for people who are not social workers. And then we're going to talk about why this works in terms of helping students grow their own ethical identity. All right, my personal connection. So I'm going to tell you a story first, and then I'm going to ask you to think of a recent ethical dilemma that you faced. But you can listen first, and then I'll give you time to think. Okay, so when I presented this to Tracy and the staff, the program that I wanted to carry out was very involved a lot of students, and a lot of it, believe it or not, involved food. So I am a person who really loves to come together with people over food. I like to bake cookies for all my classes. I have people over to dinner all the time, and I thought, this would be so fun. I'll have the students sit down, we'll make dinner, we'll do dinner here somewhere, and we'll come together. My plan was for them to interview each other and have this whole, it was a big to-do in my mind. And then, last year we had all of those problems in budget, right? And it seems like everything we got from anybody on campus was about budget and cutting the budget, being diligent. It's like, when I started really doing my research and figuring out how much it was going to cost to carry out my grand plan, it was not going to be cheap. And I personally don't have the money to just pay for it myself. So I started thinking about how this is an ethical dilemma, right? Because I am a good steward of our university's money. I've worked in public education for a long time as a school board member, and thinking about being a good steward of our state resources, I suddenly was having this ethical dilemma about my ethics presentation. And I decided, that part of it I can let go and not spend all this money in order to create a really great presentation. So my ethical dilemma was about finances. And I think I've also still done what I said that I was going to do, so that I was ethically following what I presented to Tracy about how I was going to do this presentation and the project. But it's funny how ethics can really come up when you're like about something that you're not even thinking is an ethical issue. So that's my example. I'd like you to all take just a minute or so, and think about an ethical dilemma that you faced recently. Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep going because I know they're out there. I mean, if you think about it, we all had to sign disclosure statements, right? I think we have to sign them every year at the beginning of the school year. We have to say if they're called non-competes, but there are a lot of very common ethical considerations that we have to take, even in our own job here at the university. That maybe don't have to do with teaching, but have to do with how we behave in the world as an ethical person, or thinking about how when we're making hiring decisions, how things like that can affect all the people around us. We're seeing it right in the macro political system and how our world is functioning right now. Okay, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Daniels Fund principles and the NASW ethics. I know I mentioned before that as social workers, we all have to agree that we will abide by our code of ethics or we cannot be social workers. So this is kind of small, so I'm just going to go over here so I can read to you. The Daniels Fund principles are integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, the rule of law, and viability. NASW, you'll hear, are similar. We value service, social justice, the dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationship, integrity, and competence. And those really do cross over quite a bit. If you think about accountability, integrity, and honesty, both focus on those in terms of both personally and professionally. The respect for others, I think you see both in the NASW code, the dignity and worth of all people, and in the Daniels principles, the ethic, the fairness and respect. When you think about fairness and justice, social workers are obligated to follow social justice, fairness to all, and the ethics principles are also about fairness and people being treated justly. So they're not worded exactly the same, but they are very similar. And then we both have lawfulness, we have to follow the law, and professionalism, we have to follow the reasonable rules of our professions. Can anybody think of, so taking the two examples that we just heard about like a board and thinking about hiring decisions or using AI and how we as professors or staff members incorporate this new technology into our world that our students are using and maybe learning or not learning, which of these ethical principles stands out for you when you think about those two different ethical dilemmas?
So in terms of an ethical dilemma, excuse me, the rule of law, in terms of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiatives and the NASW Code of Ethics, this might be semantics, but the rule of law for the NASW Code of Ethics, I think, is less utilitarian, and it's kind of social ethics, whereas like you could have a law or a rule that is good for the majority within the context, but that still kind of has marginalized peripheries. So I guess, I don't know if I'm understanding the question right, but how would you kind of address that potential for rule of law to be unethical at certain points?
Okay, so I love your philosophical take on things. I love that when you speak in our meetings. What I was thinking about was like, for the example, the AI, and when you were going to say rule of law, I was thinking, students have to sign an honor code here, right? That they will not cheat. And it is cheating if somebody else writes your work for you. So using AI, somebody else writing your work for you. So to me, that's an ethical breach.
What would an ethical use AI?
You guys, when you ask a question, you really have to talk real loud because they can't hear on the virtual.
My question was, what would be an acceptable and ethical use of AI? As a student, it would be foolish to completely overlook its value But it would also be foolish to allow for it to be used to do people's work for them. So
Right. So does anybody have any, Catherine, do you guys have you figured out how to do it yet? Or do you have an idea?
I think that the conundrum that we're facing is like a conflict between some of these values, right? So we have what's fair to our faculty and staff, right, in terms of expectation of workload and taking on this monumental challenge, right? What's fair to them and expectation, in addition to the workload they're already carrying. And then how do we balance that with helping our students to come into their potential in terms of integrity, trust, learning, for example, like Chris was asking, how does citation factor in? Right? How can I use AI while also upholding this code of conduct? That's something that would fall on the instructor, right? To be able to help students navigate. Now, I don't have a lesson plan ready for that. I'm going to have to make one up with that additional labor, right? And so, how do we demonstrate that we respect another value that comes in competition, that we respect our faculty, but we also value the development of these other principles within our student body, and that's
Great. Thank you for bringing in more ethics, and I appreciate it. More values. Did that answer your question well enough, Chris?
Yep.
I have to say, in the social work department, we've had the same conversation, and we actually had to devise a policy about when to use and when not to use, and depending on the professor's
well, I think
direction.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what too. Is I think we have to establish accepted and known principles for this use and,
Right.
and rules and framework for it in order for it to be successful. Because how can you hold yourself accountable if the idea of what is ethical in its use or not as a student is not defined for you?
Absolutely, that conflict is huge. And one of the reasons that we need to be so careful with the words we use when we describe what we're doing ethically and why and how, and thank you for elevating that too, that we need to make sure that our students understand why we are doing what we're doing, why we're saying what we say.
And why it's acceptable.
Exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have still a lot of students who are like, I didn't cheat, I just used AI. And I'm like, well, I can tell AI wrote that whole paper. So that is cheating, because let's talk about using citations, who writes, who does the work. And I'm super clear about it, because similar to what you described, Catherine, like, I'm not good at figuring out if people have used AI, especially if they're good and efficient at it. I'm not. So I can tell sometimes, but I can't tell all the time. And I don't think I have the capacity to learn how to read a paper for AI. I'm still like trying to focus on teaching my students how to learn, in their case study.
Yeah.
So I love that you brought up that conflict of the ethical principles that we have, depending on who the user is. So thank you for that. Okay. Let's see here. What about the example that we had from Elizabeth about the possible conflict of interest with a board member whose child wants to be hired? What conflicts do you see with these ethical principles? I mean, for me, right off the bat, I see a social justice issue, right? Like, somebody has enough money to be on a board, enough free time to be on a board, and then their child wants to work for that organization. Is that fair? Is that because their family could afford to have somebody be on a board, serve on a board, and then child gets special preferential treatment, possibly?
I think it's interesting the use of language, right, with the NASW principles, and data science uses the terminology of social justice, but I think these are on par with the relationship to fairness, right? Like, would someone else be in the same position if they're open call for the position, so that some like other folks that don't have a family member involved, that they would even know that the position exists? And there's an opportunity available. I think those are just two sides of the same coin, fairness.
Yep. Absolutely.
I walked in late, so let me, I'd also, based on what you've said though, I'd also be curious about, like, what about stakeholder visibility on the manuals at the front line?
Would it be transparency or accountability?
It might
Oh,
be
trust.
one or both
Trust,
of
you're
them.
right. Build trust in all stable relationships.
But if I were somebody who was working somewhere and had a coworker who I know was, I may think twice.
Right? Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Okay, good job, everybody. All right, let's move on. So now you've had a little bit of a foundation in thinking about how to use the ethical principles of both the Daniels Fund and National Association of Social Workers. And there are a lot of different ethical or codes of ethics, right? Those are just the two that we're going to be talking about today. So if you have one that you use in your regular work, use it, right? Like there's a medical code of ethics. You would be shocked at how many organizations that represent professions actually have codes of ethics. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about how to address ethical dilemmas, and you're going to experience one of them. So we're going to get into small groups, 2 or 3 people per group. I'm going to tell you the ethical dilemma, and then we're going to discuss, and please be ready to share the ethical dilemmas that you discern in this situation, okay? And again, for the folks online, we're going to have you all get into smaller groups. There might just be enough of you for one group. So. All right, here's the ethical dilemma. Imagine you are a new social worker and you have just gotten your first job in a new place and you are moving to, I don't know, a small town in Wyoming. And your small town is big enough to have a mental health care facility, but it's still a fairly small city. And you're new in town, so you don't really know too many people yet. And so, like many young people, you go on a dating app. You're like, oh, maybe I'll meet friends this way. And over the course of that weekend, you connect with someone and go out on a date, and it's really awesome. And Sunday comes, and you're like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen this week. And then Monday morning comes, and your second client is the person that you dated over the weekend. Right? Nobody would have guessed. You didn't know each other well enough to have a really in-depth discussion about what you're going to be doing, and the agency is big enough that it might not have been you that they assigned this person to. What are the ethical dilemmas that you are going to face in that moment when you walk out and see that person sitting in the waiting room in front of you? And how are you going to navigate? So I'm going to set my timer for 4 minutes, and then we'll come back together and talk about what you came up with. That timer for 3.5 minutes. Back together. All right, so I am dying to hear what you guys came up with. Our group online really completely solved this case.
Yeah, they solved it. They solved the issue.
You want to go first, folks online, and tell us what some of the ethical dilemmas you saw.
Well, now they're doing what they're supposed to do in class is go and say, "Is your solution, And someone else came up with someone who says, the only issue if it's a really small town, everybody will know everyone in the town. So who else are you going to have do the?
Are they willing to speak?
Do you guys anyone want to speak up? I got the volume up again. No?
If not,
You guys shy? That's okay.
I can tackle a little bit.
Oh, wait a second here.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, the group discussion online was, we had a pretty cohesive group. A lot of the participants thought recusing yourself would be the proper thing. You had that relationship and take a step back and let a peer handle that specific client. But yeah, we did also, face that dilemma. If you eventually know everyone in town, do you recuse yourself every time, or do you come up with another solution? And a lot of that was sort of on that fairness, transparency values.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Okay, how about our groups in the room? Anybody willing to let us know what you came up with?
We pretty much said the exact same thing, recuse yourself, can't be involved with that. We also said we, set them up for success, make sure that they have someone else to go to, they have those resources if you personally can't help them out because of your personal issue.
Yep. Great. And other groups have anything else that came up for you?
You said something, we just basically talked about, kind of what you guys were talking about down there, and about if it's a small town, there are limited resources. You have a duty as a social worker to make sure that anybody who needs those resources, who may not be able to get them otherwise, receive those resources. But we also brought up the part that, you could be good intention to do such a thing and make sure that that person doesn't have a crisis and doesn't have support when they leave the office and been turned down. And it can go a number of ways wrong because of those times before it.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing the issue of honesty, of transparency, and also like what does happen. You both brought up in a small town, sometimes these are issues that you will have to deal with, not just sometimes. Does anybody else have anything? Did you all come up with anything else? Any other parts of that? Same stuff. Yeah.
In addition to like integrity.
Mm-hmm. And I think I can't remember who brought up the fact that like if the person is in crisis, you also have an obligation to them as a human being, right? Not just as a social worker, to make sure that they are going to get the help they need in that moment of crisis. And in some places, Colorado is no exception. We have a lot of small rural communities. When you think about down in the valley, how few support people are down there, sometimes you can't say no. And then you have to really think about, how am I going to manage this ethical conundrum where things are in direct opposition to each other?
Kind of good.
Right. I don't know about any laws like that for social workers in our state. But I would think that the Good Samaritan laws that are in place in states would also accommodate that sort of situation. Usually, if someone is in a crisis, you're going to cause less harm by getting them through the crisis than by having a commingled relationship. All right, any other thoughts? Okay. So thank you for thinking through that situation. It is one that we give to our social work students in their first year of the master's program. And it's always interesting to think about what are all the different pieces that come in, right? Some people who are from cities, it does not occur to them at all that, there might only be one provider in a town because their experience is just so vastly different from that. So it's good to have a broader conversation because you hear other things that come up that other people miss. Okay. So now I'm going to just take a minute and describe to you in this little interlude how social work education works in the entire United States and Canada. So we have a bachelor's of social work and a master's of social work programs at our university. Some places just have a bachelor's, some places just have a master's. In our state, we don't have a licensure for bachelor level social workers. So people in our state typically go on to get a master's in social work if they want to be licensed. And you can only work as a social worker. Like you can only call yourself a social worker if you have gone to an accredited program. And it's a 3-year accreditation process. It is brutal, but we are accredited, and we got accredited our first time around here at UCCS. So we're pretty excited about that. The way that our education is devised is that it's between classwork and an internship. So I said earlier, we used to call the internship a field education or a field placement. Now we've moved to practicum education. So you'll hear me use both because I'm still not completely fluent in switching over to practicum. And practicum is really our signature pedagogy. Every student in the BSW program in their last year, they have to do 400 hours of an internship, so 200 hours per semester. And in the MSW program, which is what I'm going to be focusing on a little bit more, the first year, if you do it full time, the first year is called the generalist year, and you do those 400 hours. And the second year, you have to do 500 hours. So there is a strong impact that practicum education, that experiential learning has, and ties into the classroom that they also do. We say in social work that practicum is our signature pedagogy because no one can graduate as a social worker without having done practicum. So as I said, 400 to 500 hours of experiential learning. So when you think about it, that is I mean, for our university alone, last year we provided about 60,000 hours of unpaid volunteer service in our community. And obviously our students receive quite a lot back for that unpaid labor, but it's a lot of labor. So the way that social work education out in Practicum's work is that there's an instructor who's already a professional in the field. They have to have 2 years of experience post MSW to be an instructor or a supervisor. Everybody gets at least a full hour of supervision per week, and sometimes more, and they do both individual and group supervision in order to learn how to do their jobs. We also have a Practicum seminar that all the students who are in Practicum participate in, and those professors do in-class teaching and learning and help the students synthesize what they're doing in their experiential learning and what they're learning in the classroom. That's also that in-class seminar is also a great opportunity to role model peer supervision for students. So they will discuss cases that they have, and they have the opportunity to reflect on their colleagues' cases, and also to get sometimes good and sometimes feedback on their cases. Key assignments that we use for this kind of education are process recordings, which is when someone literally writes down exactly what has happened in a situation, like a phrase, like the student said to me, I hate you. And then you describe how you think the student said that, what they were really talking about. What does it mean when someone says, I hate you to them? You describe the whole process, and you do that for a whole interaction. It could be an exhausting process, but it's very educating. We do journals, we use discussion, and we use peer supervision. All right, how does this all associate back to ethics? So because our entire profession is based on that NASW Code of Ethics, it's foundational to how we exist as social workers and how we need to educate our students to exist as social workers. Like I said before, in our classes, we assess and evaluate cases. So situations like the situation that you guys just evaluated and thought about. We do out loud class discussion. We do group work, which of course we do individual reflection, and every assignment in the entire program, not just the Practicum program, includes ethical components. We also role model, like I said, peer supervision in every seminar class, because when our students go out into the world, it can be challenging to have these conversations, to face these ethical issues, and to not have someone to bounce ideas off of, right? Or you might think, oh, I've thought of every single way that I could examine this case, but somebody else might have a different idea, and it might be exactly what you need in order to ethically interact in that situation. So, the experiential learning that we do with our students, the reason that it's beneficial and the reason that I want to encourage you all to take these ideas and skills back to your non-social work classrooms is because that kind of interactive learning, the reciprocity when students are giving and receiving feedback, is such a great way for them to not only learn from and for each other, teach each other, but also to carry that out into the world when they go out and they face things like these. It's also practice. We're repeatedly applying those ethical principles to practice settings, just the way that you guys did twice here. And then using an ethical framework, whatever it is that you all use in your profession, to actually practice making ethical decisions. And then you also give them broad experience by responding to those situations outside of their own Practicum placement. Like, I loved that Elizabeth brought up a board situation, right? Because a lot of our younger students, a lot of our students, I feel really old, so just say that's about me, not about them, haven't necessarily had an opportunity to serve on it, right? So may not have faced an ethical dilemma like that. And so when our students share what they're experiencing at different Practicum sites, they're providing each other with additional experience that they might not otherwise have. And they also get to apply those ethical principles more broadly in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise thought of. If they're only thinking about kids, or they're working at DHS and they're only thinking about removing kids from parents, right? It's also helpful to think about adult protective services, or people who are like exiting from the penal system that we have. Those ethical dilemmas all come up, and when you have a framework like we have in an ASW or Daniel's Fund, you can always apply them to every situation that you're in, and your students will too. How you translate this to the classroom. So I would say, and somebody said this earlier, I can't remember, Catherine, you always want to be clear, and you want to be very, very transparent and explicit about how people are framing their ethical both dilemmas and how you are going to resolve it, right? And I'm putting this in the framework of ethical identity formation. So social workers develop their identity based on the NASW Code of Ethics. And everybody else who's not a social worker is going to have to go out there and think about what is the code, what is the ethical identity that my students have, and how can I help them build that? It's a little bit more challenging if you don't have a code of ethics for your profession, but not impossible at all, right? We have so many different kinds of ways that people build their ethical identity. Can anybody think of a couple? Religion? Religion is a huge one, yes. Any other? Therapy, yeah, you learn a lot about yourself and how you want to be in the world through therapy. Culture, definitely.
Thinking of students, I think it happens in the classroom when there's the reflection and the dialogue and discourse, right, around different ideas that challenge what our personal values are versus the professional values.
So we might come in with like a religious foundation, say, oh, well, my religion says that I should ethically think this. And then you come into a classroom where there are people who have different types of ethical identity formation. And you're like, oh, that actually makes a lot more sense than what I was experiencing. Then you have the ethical dilemma of how to resolve that, right? But that does happen very frequently, thank you, Isla, in classrooms because people are coming together in ways that are new and different and diverse. If you're doing this kind of identity formation in your classes, like Isla said, sometimes it just happens very naturally because of the course of the conversation or the discussion that you're having. But it's also really helpful, I think, to have that conversation first, right? Be clear and explicit, but then connect that theory. So for us, it's the code of ethics to the practice. We do that in our practice. In other classrooms, I could see, can anybody see how that might work in another type of classroom? And I love that, like, from business to English, right? We can think about ways that we can have an ethical foundation for our students as long as we do think about it and tie it together for them.
Oh, online they're saying parents.
Parents, yes.
Parents and other role models such as teachers and managers. So
yeah, mentorship, that's great. Another thing that you could do, similar to the way that Catherine was just describing and that we do in social work, is also to weave ethics into all of your assignments, right? Like if people are not asked to reflect on ethics, they're not gonna, because it's not necessarily, unless you come from a very, in my experience, like religious household or very strong culture where everyone is focused on what everybody else is supposed to do. And that's a little less common nowadays, right? Like we tend to be a little bit more casual in the way that we raise our children or engage with our religious institutions, maybe not here in Colorado Springs, but certainly nationwide. So weaving that into everything that you do, we feel in social work is a really important way to help people continually think about how they do things. And then I think it's really important to follow up at the end, right? At the end of your class, at the end of your paper or assignment, to ask students, how was that? How was that for you? Like, how did that help you? Or did you feel like it hindered you in any way when you had to think about the ethics of what you were doing? And I love to ask people how they think they've changed, because people love to reflect on themselves and they love to share what they've experienced. And it's a great way for everybody else to hear how the people in your class have changed, and give them ideas about, oh, did I do that? I should do that a little bit, right? It's a less confrontational and patriarchal way to help people gain wider experience. Okay, so I know that this was originally touted as students' voices, and that's because, back to my original ethics dilemma, I thought I was going to be recording and meeting with students over dinners. But instead, I met with students just one-on-one and asked them their opinions. At the end of, so students that I had worked with for a year and a half, asked them, like, how has your ethical formation changed? What do you think about this? And I did this in the context of our Practicum class, our Practicum seminar, because I am one of the professors of the Practicum seminar. And I've been talking about this for a while because I've had this on my brain for a while. So I'm giving you some voices, because the interesting thing was that so many students said a very similar, like even word for word, same thing. So one student said, my own ethical development is due to UCCS support. I was like, no, trying not to actually keep my face straight, but it's not, that's what I was doing. And a few people later, somebody said, you beat ethics over my head in a good way. And again, I was like, yeah. But the one that like really warmed my heart the most, and this two people said something like this, was that the ethics in all my classes have made me confident to stand up for what I believe in because I can base it in ethics. And this was someone who, over the last 2 years, has really struggled to have her voice heard. And I felt so proud of her for being able to internalize the way that she has learned about the ethics that we teach over the last year and a half for this student, because it's a pretty powerful thing to say, like to have that confidence to stand up for yourself. So it wasn't as funny, but it was really moving to me. And there were two people who said that in the small group discussion that I was doing. I didn't get anybody who said this, like it was stupid, or I don't believe in the ethics of social work. Like, obviously they're not going to be able to graduate if they think that, so we'd have a lot of conversation to be had, but I do think that genuinely this is how this represents the majority of the voices of the students. So after asking these questions, there were also, and I'm sure you guys find this too in your classes, like people say absolutely opposite things about the exact same situation. So one person was like, oh, I liked that all the assignments had an ethical component, but then somebody else was like, I wish we just had one assignment where we focused on ethics. And then somebody else said, I wish we got to discuss ethical situations more extensively. I was like, right. Some people liked that ethics were woven into every class. Some wish they just had the one big class. Some would like it as an elective. Some people think the ethics class should be required. Other people literally said, similar to what Tracy said, you know, I've been in the military for 20 years. Like, we use ethical decision-making, or we have principles that we must follow. And they were very kind about it. They were like, I know that everybody needs to have a required ethics class. And that's true, right? So that was good feedback for everybody else to hear. Somebody said, I loved what I learned about ethics in our classes, and it was so like enlightening and new to them. And then the other person was like, well, I've used ethics and ethical practice before. So you can't please everyone, but by focusing at least a little bit on ethics in an ongoing way, I think that we have a much better opportunity to help our students both learn and continually improve in using ethics. Okay, this was, I loved this quote as well from one of our students. When ethics become part of our identity, we act more ethical. I think that's really valuable. And I thought that was a great observation by that student as well. So now I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions for me? And I'm going to challenge you, how will you integrate your ethical foundation into something you do today? You don't have to answer that part, but I am here now to answer any questions that you have. And just to say thank you so much for participating in our presentation.